Welcome back to an episode of the Bourbon Pursuit Podcast, the official podcast of bourbon. And we're going to go ahead and just wait a minute because the mailman's here. This episode of Bourbon Pursuit is made possible through listeners like you, supported through Patreon. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bourbon Pursuit, the official podcast of bourbon. And as always, let's go through the news. This past weekend was Father's Day, so if you had an opportunity on Sunday to kick back, relax, enjoy a nice glass of bourbon, I hope you did. So happy belated Father's Day to all those fathers out there. Thanks for enjoying the show. Last Thursday was also National Bourbon Day, and we kind of forgot to talk about it because I think almost every day is National Bourbon Day for us. And I think we're going to have to create a calendar with all these made-up holidays that somehow just keep creeping up on us. Last week, we did a little bit of a PSA talking about if you own or operate a liquor store and want to drive some more foot traffic, we have an opportunity for you. We've partnered with 2 stores already. We're looking to bring 1, maybe 2 more on. Send us an email, theduo, THEDUO, at bourbonpursuit.com, and let's see if we can't find a good partnership. And that kind of leads us into our next announcement, is that our next barrel that is going to be available to Patreon supporters is going to be a barrel of Russell's Reserve, one of those great all-American products that we love from Wild Turkey, and we're happy to be partnering with Liquor Barn here in Louisville, Kentucky. So make sure you go and you shop at Liquor Barn or Party Mart here in Louisville, and thank you, Liquor Barn, again for partnering with us. And let's make a party out of this. I guess that's a good way to put it. And if you haven't heard of today's guest, then you don't know one of the greatest unsung heroes in bourbon. MGP really came on the map a few years ago when an article by the Daily Beast was created, and it was called "Your Craft Whiskey is Probably from a Factory in Indiana." It really shed some light on how distilleries, who were, quote, proud of their roots or kept distillation alive, were becoming ousted as more and more consumers caught on to the sourcing game. And now we see brands like Boone County and New Riffs OKI, that is 10 to 13-year-old MGP stock, starting to really go bananas on the gray market. And we really owe a great debt of gratitude to Greg Metze, who was in charge of all the distillation at Seagram's for almost 38 years, but has now moved on to Old Elk in Colorado. So we're excited to see what's going to come out of there. And as always, if you like the show, go support us on Patreon. As I mentioned, we've got barrel picks coming, so we've got Russell's Reserve, we've got Willet, we've got barrel bourbon, we've got another kind of little project that I'll be able to talk about relatively soon. Ryan and I are heading to a state that's right below us to go and select some barrels, and I'll give you some hints about what's coming on through there relatively soon as well. But as always, Patreon has all kinds of good stuff. We got bottle totes, patches, t-shirts, and more. So go ahead, check it out, support the show, get cool stuff. If you like the show, make sure you also are subscribed to us. If you are listening on iTunes or Podcast or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you go and you hit the subscribe button. If you're more of a video person, check out YouTube and Facebook. And for all those that are watching on video, hopefully you like the new background. I rearranged the desks and tried to give something that's a little bit more bourbon themed into it. So now you get to get a different view of the office. Also, make sure you are following us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can see where we're traveling, what we're drinking, and essentially all the chaos that might happen on a Friday or Saturday evening. And if you want to get all the new episodes, get them straight to your inbox. You get all the show notes with all the links, and you can see the pictures. Go ahead, go to bourbonpursuit.com, sign up for our email list, and you can get signed up there, and you'll get all the new episodes, 7 a.m. every Thursday, into your inbox. With that, enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit Podcast, the official podcast of bourbon. Today, Kenny and Ryan here, and we're talking with somebody who's a legend in his own right. It is, somebody that is not really been in the limelight for a long time. However, his products have finally seen a resurgence. People are talking about them all the time, and it's going to be really cool to get his take and more information. It's really hard to get those sealed doors.
Yeah, I mean, MGP is one of those, things that people know about, but they don't know a lot about. But the guest today, we've been wanting to talk to him for a while, so I'm super excited because his, background is well known and his accolades are, just he's the man. So
I was about to say, I was like, if you own it, maybe at the most, like anywhere between like maybe 5 bottles of bourbon, 5 bottles of rye, there's probably a good chance that maybe at least 30 to 70
his fingerprints on it.
Yeah, at least 30 to 70% of them are something that point, right? So let's go ahead and introduce our guest today. So our guest is Greg Metze. Greg is the owner and proprietor of a consulting company called Master Distiller Methods LLC, but you know him as because he had a long history with a very famous Indiana distillery called Mgp Ingredients, where he had spent nearly 40 years of his life. So, Greg, welcome to the show.
Hello, guys. Glad to be here.
Good. We're glad to have you on as well. So I guess we want to go back and we're going to start at the way, way, way beginning here, right? And even before work even got involved here. So talk about, your introduction into whiskey. Was it your parents? Was it schooling? Like what got you to the point where you were introduced to whiskey?
Well, truly it was pure luck. I went my background is chemical engineering. I got my degree at University of Cincinnati. And during senior year back then, the companies would come to campus to recruit. And as luck would have it, at the time, Seagram's Distillery came on campus, did recruiting. I went through the interview process and was lucky enough to have been offered a job. And a week after I graduated, I was starting work at the Seagram Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Frankly, I didn't have any clue about whiskey and what it was. I just thought, sounds like a really cool job, getting to make distilled spirits and whatnot. And I had been by that plant a lot because I was growing up in Cincinnati. Lawrenceburg's only about a half hour south. So I knew of the plant, and every time you were near it, you could smell it. And it was like, just a really cool place. And as luck would have it, they interviewed. I was lucky enough to get offered a job and started at the ground level as a entry-level shift manager. So yeah, and that started that started what wound up being nearly a 40-year career at that facility, and I spent all of it on the distillery side of the process. So it was very cool. It was just very cool. And
were you a whiskey drinker? Were you a whiskey drinker before you started there? Or?
Well, the truth of the matter is that as much as I enjoy making it and know how to make it, I'm not truly a whiskey drinker. And the reason is that my metabolism just doesn't handle it very well.
Neither does ours, but we haven't learned it yet.
So I have to enjoy it in very much moderation for that reason. But so yeah, I basically got into the business not knowing what the business was. The truth of the matter is.
So you looked at it more like from an engineering perspective rather than a passion to actually say, like, I love drinking this stuff. It more or less, you looked at it as a way that you can start crunching numbers to get the things that you wanted out of it.
Yeah, it was that as much as it was that all the processes involved with making whiskey is very suitable for a chemical engineering degree. So you get fluid dynamics, you get instrumentation controls, you get distillation, you get thermodynamics. So really all the processes that are involved with making good whiskey all relates back to what I learned in college. So that was really at least initially, that was what drew me to the plant.
So if you started off as a first line manager there, where was the trajectory and how did you actually get into part where you're just distilling? And I guess when you're the first line manager, were you actually part of the distillation process then too, or kind of walk us through that career path?
Yeah, well, it was that was another one of the blessings of working at Seagram's was back then Seagram's had a very intensive training program, if you will, and it was all on the job training primarily. So part of their training and educational process was that you pretty much rotated through every department at the distillery, and you spent a year up to 1 to 3 years migrating through all the different departments so that you had exposure to all the aspects that were involved in the whiskey process. So that meant like maintenance, engineering, pardon me, bottling was even part of it for most folks, into the distillery proper. So my particular advancement or whatever is I started there as a maintenance supervisor, and I had for I guess the first year I had my responsibility was being the electrician and coppersmith supervisor. So I'm a young punk at 21 years old, wet behind the ears, and I'm suddenly supervising craftspeople, union craft people that have been into business for, well, most of them were probably in the area of my dad's age. So I learned a lot fast about people management, if you will. And that's really was the way Seagram's designed it. A lot of the emphasis was on, learning all the intricacies of making whiskey, but it was also about making you a good people manager. So all those different stepping stone roles that I had along the way were all part of the grooming process that really made me what I am today.
Managing people is probably the hardest part, harder than making whiskey.
Yeah, that's something I always said, that the equipment's always easier than the people, and from my standpoint, I was very lucky. I did very well in the people management arena, and that's probably one of the things I miss the most is interacting with all the operators on a daily basis. So, but going back then, like I said, I started as a maintenance shift supervisor, and then from there they sent me to a utility shift supervisor. So then, which involved the boiler and water softening and demineralized water. So I was in that role for about a year, and then from there I migrated to engineering as a process engineer, and I spent 10 years in that role, and that's where I really learned the distillery equipment. So most if not all of my jobs and responsibilities or projects were all based in the distillery area. So I did still installations, dryer installations, any of the equipment that was associated with the distillery would have come under my umbrella in that process engineering role. And then I also got heavily involved in the instrumentation and programming part of it, which was really valuable. And then after the 10-year stint there, then I was moved to distillery maintenance planner for a 3-year stint. And during that period of time, we had negotiated what you call a flexibility agreement with the unions. And back then we had, I believe we had 13 different unions relative to crafts and laborers. And that flexibility agreement was something that allowed all those different crafts groups to be able to do other crafts work on a limited basis. And if you look at that going back probably 30 years ago, that was a really new concept, if you will, relative to the labor unions and management. So it was a tough job. It was at the end of the day, you left and you didn't feel like you accomplished anything. But it was one of those jobs that after the fact, after I left that position and moved on to the distillery proper, is when you realize everything you learned in that role carried forward and made you a more successful person. After that 3-year stint as that maintenance planner, that's when I started into the distillery proper. During that period at Seagram's, they had 3 different departments within the distillery. They had a dry house coordinator, and they had a cooking and fermentation coordinator, and then they had a distillation coordinator. So I started in the dry house coordinator role, which was probably the most difficult role in the distillery relative to keeping the place running. The dry house was always the most maintenance intensive part of the operation, handling all that wet, hot, acidic stillage and feed and drying it into cattle feed was just brutal on equipment. And the way the distillery was put together, that if the dry house or the back end of the plant went down within hours, the whole plant would be down. So it was crucial that you kept that dry house operation moving. And
I don't know if I've ever heard of a dry house before. What's technically a dry house?
Well, basically that's what we called the part of the plant that takes all the spent slop from the beer stills after you've extracted the alcohol. Then we dried that spent slop into distiller's dry feed. So we actually dewatered all that slurry, if you will, and into a dry cattle feed component. A lot of the smaller distilleries, most of them sell the slop right directly to farmers and don't dry it. But the Seagram facility was such a big facility relative to the size of those other folks that there was no way
actually get rid of that much slop.
Actually get rid of it fast enough to keep up. So we actually had a dry house associated with that distillery.
Nothing like making money off waste, you know.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that we made money on it, but it covered the cost to dry it, and it got it out of our way. So, I mean, there's different ways of looking at it for sure. There were some years where the cost of energy were such that we actually lost money drying it, but if we didn't dry it and get it out of our way, then
you're being more trouble than if you just had
the alternative was that you would be shutting down or slowing down.
Right.
So I spent a year a little better in that position, and then they moved me from there to the cooker fermentation coordinator position. So that's where I learned. I got my dogs coming with me. So that's where I learned the mashing and the fermentation end of it, which was probably the most, I would say, the most technical part of making whiskey for sure. If you don't ferment correctly, then everything after that's just going to be that much harder or impossible relative to making a quality whiskey. And then from the fermentation coordinator job, then I moved to the distillation coordinator job. And that's where I learned all the distillation techniques that were associated with that facility. And one of the lucky things for me is that I was able to learn all facets of distillery distillates because Seagram's at that time made neutral grain spirits. It was a big part of the 7 Crown blend. We made a variety of bourbon and rye and corn whiskey mash bills, so I learned all the whiskey end of it through that. And then we also made dry gin. So from a master distiller standpoint, I wound up being well versed in all facets of distilled spirits.
How long were you in that role?
I spent probably 2 years in the distillation coordinator role, and then I moved on from there to production manager, and then I became responsible for all 3 of those coordinator positions.
more responsibility, less pay, right?
Yeah, and then then that got me into with that came the added responsibility of managing the distillery and all three facets of the distillery, which then got me into doing budgets and the financial end of it. And I probably, Pete, I probably spent about 8 years in that role.
Right.
And then from there, then I moved to the master distiller position, which was basically the same thing that I had been doing for the last 8 years, but I just assumed the further responsibility of making sure that all the distillates, and that's really where you get into the responsibility for the quality and the tradition and all the craftsmanship part of it.
Absolutely.
So I was very fortunate. I mean, in this day and age, companies just don't have the time to invest in their people to put them through a training process like I was able to go through. And I would say that I was probably one of the last individuals that probably across the industry that had that kind of opportunity.
Yeah, I was about to say, I mean, you was very impressive because you're not shitting me. Like, there wasn't anything you didn't touch from the entire process, right? So it's impressive.
It's absolutely true. And to the day I left, I mean, I still spent probably half my time on the management quality end of it, and the other half I was still out in that distillery, next to the operators, troubleshooting issues and fine-tuning processes. So I was really, really fortunate that I could still have hands-on after all those years.
And the one thing that's incredibly different is, a lot of people say that, oh, they've touched every part of it. They've been in every facet. However, what makes it different with you is that MGP is a much, much larger operation, right? Can you give any kind of idea of how big it is, whether amount of fermentation tanks, stills, barrels that are being dumped or pulled out per day?
Wow. Well, we had, equipment wise, on the cooker end, starting at the cooker end, we had two 13,000 gallon batch cookers that we used for the traditional whiskeys. And then we had what we called a continuous U-tube pressure cooker that we used for the neutral grain spirit side. And we were mashing probably in the neighborhood of 17,000 bushels a day, those two cookers. And then on the fermentation end, we had 21 50,000 gallon fermenters for the neutral grain spirit side, and we had 14 25,000 gallon fermenters for the traditional whiskey side.
It's pretty large.
Distillation wise, we had 3 vacuum gin stills that would produce about 45,000 proof gallons a day. We had two beer stills for the continuous side that would produce about 24 million proof gallons a year. And we had a beer still doubler arrangement for the traditional whiskey side that would put out about 6 million proof gallons a year. It's really hard to put the scale of that facility into words. It's one of those things.
Can you compare it to like any distilleries here in Kentucky in size?
Well, when I started there, I think we were the largest distillery in the world. And I think probably to this day, they're probably top 5 in the world. But relative to probably the Kentucky distilleries, we were probably 3 times or better bigger than most of them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's just huge. It's massive.
Yeah, and I knew almost every pipe and every piece of equipment. I could run every piece of equipment in that entire facility. So, I mean, it wasn't unusual to get calls at night, and I could explain how to resolve the issue over the phone, and I could explain the piping over the phone and tell them where to find the issue. So I literally knew that plant like the back of my hand.
Now you can do Google Hangouts to do that, now that you know.
Yeah, there you go. So they could probably show me a picture and I could probably still explain it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to talk a little bit about, some of the products as well, right? Because, you had mentioned that you did, you had a high rye bourbon, low rye bourbon, you had rye whiskey, there was neutral grain spirit. What was there one that was more or less produced? Should I say, is there one that was more produced than any of the others? Because it seems that MGP is very well known for rye right now.
Yeah, that was a migration, actually. I mean, we had the 95% rye mash bill that is so popular now was basically a component of Seven Crown. Both the bourbon mash bills that you mentioned, the high rye, low rye, there was a 21% rye and a 36% rye bourbon mash bill. Those were components of Seven Crown blend. And then we also made a corn whiskey mash bill that was part of that Seven Crown blend. So I don't know if you guys know it, but I mean, that distillery was acquired by the Seagram family or the Brofman family in 1933 during Prohibition. And after Prohibition was lifted, they started the plant like immediately, and they built that plant to be a Seven Crown plant. So the fact that we made neutral grain spirits, that was a component of Seven Crown. And those four staple mash bills that I just mentioned were all the straight whiskey components that went into that blend. And then the gin was just an additional brand that Seagram's had that they produced as well. So, I mean, that was probably the way it was for the first 20 years of my career. I mean, it was all Seagram products, and that was it. But then when Seagram's got out of the business and split their brands up between Diageo and Pernod Ricard, then we operated under Pernod Ricard for I don't know what it was, 7 or 8 years, and basically the plant continued doing what they always did. They just kept producing all those products to fulfill the brands that Seagram sold to Diageo and Pernod. When Pernod acquired Allied Domecq, they wound up with 2 distilleries and 2 bottling houses, and at that point they only needed 1 distillery and 1 bottling house. So they went through a process of determining, who was most economical to Pernod Ricard, and it wound up being that the Lawrenceburg plant kind of lost that battle. So at that point, the facility went up for sale, and that's when LDI acquired us. And at that point, that's when we instantly became a contract distiller. And
what time frame was this?
Oh, see, I think I think it was about 2008, I believe.
Okay.
Memory serves me right. And I think we operated under LDI for 4 to 4.5 years. I think, can't remember when they acquired us. I was thinking that was maybe in spring of 2008. Angostura LDI bought us, and I think MGP bought us right at the end of January in 2000. Mm-hmm. I'd have to double check some of those dates to make sure they're totally accurate. But anyway, we operated as LDI for 4 or 4.5 years, and that was a very challenging and a very rewarding part of my career. Actually, it was probably my joining Old Elk. That was probably the most fulfilling 4.5 years I had at that whole facility, because we actually operated that like a family-owned business. So we had literally no support from Angostura financially. I mean, we had to be a profit. We had to be a profit center. We wouldn't have survived. And we essentially started from nothing when Angostura bought us. And by the end of that 4 years, we weren't making a ton of money, but we were certainly a profit center.
Absolutely.
But anyway, that, like I said, that was a really challenging 4.5 years, because we had zero support, and we still, with the staff that we had and the folks that we had to run the plant, were able to survive and actually turn a small profit.
I was about to say is like now it isn't necessarily too hard to turn a profit on it. But, I kind of want to rewind a little bit when LDI was taken over and you were still performing your 4 or 5 mash bills, and then you had switched over to contract distilling. Were you doing custom blends not custom blends, but custom mash bills for people? Or was it still just the same mash bills you've been doing and you just said, go have your choice of barrels?
Yeah, I mean, for the bulk of that 4.5 years, yeah, we did two things. I mean, we continued to make products for Diageo and Pernod. I mean, they wound up being or continuing to be customers of the facility. So, at the point that LDI took over, the plant didn't have any brands of their own to support, but we still had Diageo and Pernod as customers and still supported their brands. So that was a bulk of our business early on, and then we started start laying the groundwork to produce for other folks as contract distillers. And two things happened at that point. I mean, we broke a lot of ground and acquired a lot of new customers in the craft arena, and then what also helped is that, the whiskey boom was starting about the same time. So
yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the boom, but another question about just the amount or the ratio of what's being pushed out. So with the 5 core mash bills, was there a breakout of, to say, like, we did more rye than we did of the high rye or low rye bourbon? What was sort of the breakout of how much stocks were allocated to each piece?
They were probably early on. I would say they were probably in the neighborhood of. Again, it's stretching my memory a little bit, but we were probably I'd say probably 40% of the rye mash bill, 95% rye, and probably 60% of the staple bourbon mash bills. And part of that was driven by the Diageo Pernod Ricard requirements. But then, as you know, like, rye whiskey got very popular around that same period too. So those ratios are probably altogether different now than they were, 10 years ago or 2008? Yeah, 10 years ago.
Right.
So, I mean, the whole business from the time I started to the time I left was a migration in many, many ways. I mean, and it probably continues to be a migration.
So I guess another question is, do you kind of pride yourself in knowing that a good percentage of the bourbon and rye that you see on the shelves at any liquor store you go to is something that you had a part to play in?
Yeah, sure. It's, for most of my career, because we were a distillery built to make Seagram products, for everybody outside of that Seagram world, that was kind of the best kept secret relative to the products that we could produce there. And that secret didn't start getting exposed, I think, probably up until the last 8 or 10 years. So, yeah, I think it's a tribute to the people that work there and a tribute to the facility that they make some of the best whiskeys, if not the best whiskeys in the world, and that's probably known more now than ever as a result of the craft arena and folks like yourself who realize it and promote it. And
yeah,
was contract distilling a thing before 10 years ago, before this bourbon boom? Like, it's something I really never heard of, before.
No, it really wasn't. I mean, it's a lot of that was driven by the popularity of the craft distilleries, which have really taken off. And I think, up till 10 years ago, all the distilleries were basically just producing for themselves. And the whole bourbon trend has always had peaks and valleys. So I can remember, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago or better, where there was just a whiskey glut. All the distilleries were like saturated with inventory. And I think maybe some of that some of that popularity with the crafts was related to that glut, because most of the more popular distilleries were selling off whiskey pretty cheap because they didn't have use for it. Their brand demand didn't dictate the inventory that they had, and I know that we suffered through that at the Lawrenceburg facility for a period as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's everything's, a lot of it just happened by happenstance, if you will. It wasn't a design so much as it was, I guess, luck.
Right. They weren't like, we're going to decide this is our niche. It just kind of fell into their lap.
But the contract, the actual contract distilling part, where we started getting into the custom mash bills and whatnot, I mean, that was really driven by the versatility and the flexibility of that Lawrenceburg facility. We were, it wasn't designed on purpose, but we had the ability to capitalize on the flexibility that we had there. So we had enough grain bins where we could do more than a 2-grain mash bill. The equipment we had was flexible enough that we could operate at different temperatures and different hold times and that kind of thing. Fermentation wise, same way. I mean, we did a very good job of utilizing what we had on hand and learning how to use its flexibility so that we could bring in more business, especially on the real contract specialty bourbon mash bills that we produced, and I'm sure they continue to produce them even now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you're contract distilling, do you just, like you said, you had your blend of mash bills, are you selling that to them, or are they coming with you with specs, like what they want?
It's both. And you folks may not know it, but actually besides that master distiller methods, I'm actually a full-time employee of Old Elk now out in Fort Collins. And I met those folks while we were LDI when they came to the plant and asked if we could produce their custom bourbon mash bill. And that's really where I was introduced to Richardson, who owned Old Elk. And we did. They brought us their custom mash bill, and we were able to produce it for them. And the rest is history. And I'm a full-time
now you finally
employee.
have a product that you produce that also can have your name on it, right?
Yeah. So it opened the door for me for another really tremendous opportunity. And in the past, since I've left MGP, it's been remarkable. And hopefully we can talk about more Old Elk later in the presentation if you want. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll hit on it. I kind of want to hit a few more things about MGP.
Yep.
It's a big topic that nobody really has a lot of information out. So I guess another question, I had mentioned if you felt pride of, going to a store and seeing everything. Do you ever feel angered or kind of, I don't know, I guess left out knowing that there's some NDPs out there that take your rye or bourbon and they make a fortune about it by telling some false story about where it came from?
Actually, that really never did bother me. I think I just took tremendous self-gratification out of knowing that what I produced was one of the best whiskeys in the world. And, if it wound up under a whole bunch of other different brands, that really wasn't that important to me. The most important thing to me was knowing that what was in that bottle was a top quality product. And I took all the gratification I needed from that, truly.
I'm talk about the flip side of that. I mean, if I'm an NDP, like what's the process of selling something to NDP? I mean, are they coming to NGP and asking for stuff? Or at one point was NGP like out there with a sales force trying to get rid of stuff?
Well, we were never trying to get rid of stuff. We were always soliciting customers to, buy what we could produce. So I don't think there was anything, I don't want to say underhanded, but that's what comes to mind. There was really nothing underhanded about any of that. I mean, we had taken advantage of the fact that we could produce really good whiskey, and we could produce any whiskey that would be good. So I think basically we were promoting, what that facility could do. And
Right.
to use the term trying to get rid of something, that from 2008 on, we were really contract distillers, period. And we, although we had several large customers, there was still plenty of capacity left at that plant that we could utilize for other folks, which is really what we did.
Right. So I guess another question is kind of going back to that original piece, maybe a little bit of a twist on it. Are there ever any contracts or anything like that says there's certain ways that you can or can't market an MGP based bourbon or rye?
Well, we had, that's kind of not quite sure how to answer that. I mean, from a master distiller viewpoint or whatever, I mean, we had, some of those mash bills were proprietary. I mean, if we did a custom mash bill, in a lot of cases that became a proprietary mash bill for that customer. So, we weren't able to at liberty to discuss anything like that. And I don't know. Re-ask that question again. I'm still struggling with.
It's just to say that if somebody's buying or sourcing barrels from MGP, is there any way, like, are there any boundaries to say that what they can or can't say about it?
Well, not from the facility standpoint. No, I mean, some of the folks that maybe got in trouble and overstated some of their branding, that none of that was a result of MGP or the Lawrenceburg facility. I mean, all we did was provide high quality whiskey for customers, and what they did with it after they promised was really pretty much all on them. Mm-hmm. And although there was a few that maybe got in trouble for overstating, that were completely upfront about what they were doing and were like tremendously successful. And I'm sure you know who those people are.
Mm-hmm. But oh yeah, you got your Smooth Amblers of the world and those other ones that definitely have the transparency mechanism working for you.
So yeah, I don't think the Lawrenceburg plan or any of the owners that had that plan. There was really everything that was done there was above board, and
once you buy it, it's in your hands. Yeah. You can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah.
So was there ever a time when you're contract distilling or somebody that's an NDP and they're buying or sourcing barrels that you've had to turn them away? And if so, what's the criteria for allowing somebody to come in and do it versus saying, sorry, maybe you're just not
a right fit or something?
Yeah, not buying enough stock or anything like that.
Well, I don't know that we ever put it away. I think the only real limitation was the minimum order because the plant was so big. So, if a customer only wanted a couple hundred barrels, the plant was too big. They couldn't produce just a couple hundred barrels. And there were minimum orders that customers had to meet for the facility to be able to provide them, what they wanted. So I think that really the only limitation was what the size of the plant dictated. I mean, we couldn't, if we had a 50,000 gallon fermenter and that produced 400 barrels, it's very difficult. We couldn't scale down small enough with the equipment we had to fulfill small customer orders. And some of that was based on the mash bill that they were asking for as well. I mean, if it was one of the 4 staple mash bills, and then we had the ability to make mash a run of it and split it up between 2 or 3 different customers. But if it was a specific mash bill that was somewhat of a custom mash bill, then there were limitations on how small the batch could be relative to being able to produce it. So I would say that we probably never turned anybody away for any other reason other than we couldn't produce it at small enough levels to meet their demands.
So back when we were talking about just the different types of mash bills, and we'll just take for instance the rye mash bill. There's a lot of different NDPs that use it. Now, is there something that these NDPs are doing that's unique that can make them set themselves aside? Because when I think about it, it's the same exact product going into different bottles with different labels at different price points. And I don't want to bring in like finishing into this because that's completely different, but just a straight rye whiskey, like how are customers, and I guess what's your opinion of how they can really differentiate what really drives that factor?
Oh boy, that yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I can really answer that. I mean, I certainly can't speak for MGP. I mean, I'm not an employee of MGP anymore. To that extent, I surely won't comment, on their process because that's proprietary. But I can say prior to MGP that the 95% rye mash bill that I produced when I was there was pretty much the same mash bill for everybody. And then, the folks that bought it would either, like you say, they would either finish it with their own methods, or they would blend it with their own methods, or they might even just use it straight up as it was. So, once it left the plant, didn't have any control over it, and really didn't care to have any control over it. So, once they came to us, they purchased what we could give them, and then each of those individual customers had their own way of branding it and their own methods of finishing it if they chose to do so.
Because I guess
I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, you're getting to it. I think another thing is when I think about it is like if I just look at a MGP based high rye bourbon, right? There's a lot of people that put out the straight whiskey high rye bourbon. However, are people taking them from like the same warehouses? Are they taking them from different warehouses? Because they don't all taste the same.
Yeah,
and
they're all different.
That's the kind of crazy part about it, right? I mean, you look at something like Smooth Ambler, like their MGP paste is really good. I'm not going to say who's bad, but it's different, right? And I would say it's not bad. It's just different. So what's I guess is barrel selection in different warehouses part of that as well?
Well, it all plays a small role in it. I don't. When you're talking about brands of that size, you're sort of talking about small batch whiskeys, if you will. So if they buy a lot this year and they buy a lot the following year or the following year, then those lots are bound to have a small amount of variation. It's just based on the crop year, if you will, of the grain. I mean, the grain's got a huge role in the quality of whiskey, so that changes a little bit every year. And then, warehouse to warehouse, there's probably subtle differences. There's differences relative to if it was aged on the 6th floor or the 1st floor. Although at Lawrenceburg, those warehouses are like huge batteries, so you don't really get the variation from floor to floor, or even from warehouse to warehouse, just because they're great big concrete and brick buildings, which are altogether different than what you find in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, to answer your question, I
mean, would people go and would they go to different buildings and actually
they have like their preferred spot they would pick from?
Try some P's better at selecting, better barrels than others. I mean, I don't really know.
Well,
or is it just say like, oh, you wanted 500 barrels, go to this warehouse and go and roll them out, right? I didn't know if there's like an actual pecking or a picking order to it.
Well, I think that, I truly didn't have a lot of involvement in that part of the process. I mean, that was usually driven by the sales folks in the warehouse department. But I would say it's probably a mix of all that. Before I left, we had people that they would say, we need 500 barrels of this mash bill. Well, we would make a run of that mash bill, and then, if we had 3 or 4 customers, we might divvy up that batch amongst 4 different customers. When we had aged whiskey available, then, folks would generally, they would ask for samples of certain lots of that aged whiskey, and they would choose what lot they liked the most. And if the plant had the ability to accommodate them, then they would. So I think in general that's a very broad-based question.
Yeah, it was. I was trying to
put a specific answer to, and I would say that it's some or all of that. And it varied from year to year as availability of the aged stuff diminished, and then the customers were relegated to having new distillate put down for them. So
yeah, I was about to say, did the whiskey boom hurt MGP at all of getting rid of aged stocks where you had to put in overtime to start laying down more whiskey?
Well, it never hurt them, that's for sure. I mean, that they, aged, when that boom took place, aged whiskey was a luxury. So if you had aged whiskey on hand, that the old supply and demand thing, you were sitting pretty if you had aged goods ready to sell. I would say if they had more of it, they'd love to have more of it. But I think I've been away from MGP for over a year, so I don't know what they're now. But I don't think they have much over 2-year-old in the way of aged goods. Which, truthfully, I've got a client that's looking for some 4 to 6-year-old, and I'm looking for them myself, and it's not easy to find.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about Old Elk a little bit. So kind of just give us a rundown of what it is, because I know it's based out in Colorado, right?
Yeah, they're based in Fort Collins. They're owned by Kurt and Nancy Richardson, and Kurt and Nancy were the founders of Otterbox. So that
the cell phone covers, right? Yeah,
what's going on right now.
So Kurt is a entrepreneur and innovator. Has done extremely well with the Otterbox product that he developed, and then through all that, then he's also gotten involved in other entrepreneurial roles, and he's got it all comes under the umbrella of Blue Ocean Enterprises. And Old Elk is one of the companies under that umbrella that Kurt owns and operates. So, as I alluded to earlier, I got introduced to Old Elk and Kurt and Nancy back when I was, I guess I was with MGP then. But basically, Old Elk approached MGP in the Lawrenceburg plant to see if we could produce their custom mash bill, which is 51% corn, 34% malted barley, and 15% rye. And then, again, I was a master distiller when they approached us, and we talked about it, and we decided that we could do it, and then we mashed and distilled quite a bit of inventory for Old Elk and their workhorse bourbon. So we did that. Yeah, that's a little over 3 years ago when we started putting that down. And then I left MGP June of 2016, I guess, to join the Old Elk team. Contrary to popular belief, I did not retire. I actually left MGP to join up with the Old Elk group. I was initially contracted to be Old Elk's master distiller from June when I left on a contract basis, and then this past March, Old Elk asked if they could bring me on board as a full-time employee.
And now you get to go out to Fort Collins to go skiing every once in a while too, right?
I haven't had the chance to do much skiing, but definitely make a lot of nice trips to Fort Collins. A little bit more about Old Elk there. Basically, I'm on the ground floor of something I believe to be really big. Kurt and Nancy are just remarkable individuals, and one of the things about Kurt is he's a perfectionist. He is not going to put out a product that is anything less than the best you can possibly put out. And he's built on integrity, and he's built on respect, and he's built on tradition, and he's built on craftsmanship. And I can't think of a better atmosphere to work under. And the team that he's put together, it's just a group of young, smart, really passionate individuals. We're just now getting up and running. We launched our bourbon just in the last 2 months. Right now it's in Colorado and California. And after the first of the year, then we're going to start branching out across the states on a pretty rapid pace. Old Elk also makes a distilled gin, and they also make a product called Nuku. It's a bourbon cream. They've got a small craft distillery presently in Fort Collins, and we're in the process of trying to put together a really nice tasting room in Fort Collins, and then there are plans in the future to build a sizable full-scale distillery in Fort Collins. So it's a tremendous opportunity for me, and the folks that I get to work with are remarkable, and it's going to be a really, really nice adventure.
Well, awesome.
Yeah, that
awesome.
Sounds
great. I was like, you were kind of saying a few qualities of the people and the process, and I think that's everything you need to make a great whiskey. So, I wanted to say, Greg, thanks again for coming on the show today. It was a pleasure to learn more about your history, more about MGP, and learning about Old Elk, part of the Eastern market too, because, we can't get enough bourbon here in Kentucky.
That's right.
Definitely. Well, I appreciate it, folks. Thanks for having me, for sure.
Yeah, no problem.
You got it. So if you want to learn more about Greg, you can go visit his website at Oakview Consulting. If you want to also follow us, make sure you do it on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's going to be Bourbon Pursuit. Pretty easy and pretty catchy, right?
Yeah.
And also subscribe on iTunes, subscribe on YouTube, so you can listen and you can watch all these videos that happen as we're recording them. And if you do like what you hear, make sure you support the show. Patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. We've got all kinds of levels for sending you t-shirts, samples, koozies, whatever it is. So please go there and do that. It really helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And like always, if you have any show suggestions, comments, feedback, we love hearing from you all and getting new ideas to keep bringing you great content. So keep that coming, and we'll see you next time.